This is the Human Action Podcast, where we debunk the economic, political, and even cultural myths of the days. Here's your host, Dr. Bob Murphy.
Welcome, everybody, back to the Human Action Podcast. Today, I thought it would be good to do another episode devoted to free trade and specifically the arguments and rhetoric that free traders use to explain why, hey, all this hand-wringing over trade deficits is silly and da-da-da, that sort of thing. Because what I have noticed in the last few years is that the pro-free trade camp is a bit sloppy at times. And so I want to just go through some examples today of where I think that happened. Not necessarily that they're saying something wrong, but in some cases, saying things that are not charitable to the other side. And then in some cases, just saying things flat out wrong. And as we'll see, the examples I'm going to cite for the latter include a subtitle given to a Wall Street Journal op-ed by Robert Barro. So Barro himself didn't say something wrong, but the Wall Street Journal editor who presumably typed up the subtitle to the op-ed, reading Barro's text when he or she, but I think it was probably he, went to summarize it, said something false, and then also a clip from Milton Friedman where he just says a bunch of nonsense, right? You can understand where he was coming from, but it just epitomizes the kind of thing I'm talking about in this episode. But before I dive into all that stuff, and let me be clear too at the outset, I am not for tariffs except in the sense that I've gone over on this very podcast and explained, okay, yeah, if it's part of a package deal where you're going to reduce personal income or corporate income tax rates, you're going to cut government spending, and then you're going to slightly bump up the percentages on some tariffs. If you're saying you have to choose between the status quo or that new combination of policies, I would think the latter would be better. All right. And certainly if you jacked it up and you really slash government spending such that with the higher tariffs, you could get rid of the personal income and corporate income tax altogether and get rid of the IRS. So Americans aren't having to keep track of all their income and send it into the government every year, then that would be, slam dunk. Just because it wouldn't just be merely an economic issue, it would also be like one of privacy and so forth. Okay, so I've said that. So that's the limited qualified sense in which I'm listening if Team Trump wants to talk about increasing tariffs, if they mean it as part of a broader thing, and I actually believe they were going to do those other things. But nonetheless, in general, yes, I still believe in free trade. The arguments from Bastiat and Henry George and Murray Rothbard, for that matter, those are all still, Henry Hazlitt, those are all still valid, okay? But again, I'm making the modest point that in this episode, I have just seen the rhetoric that some free traders over the years are strutting around acting like anybody who disagrees with what we're saying is a complete idiot who doesn't know Econ 101, and it's just ironic because a lot of times they botch simple concepts too, even the great Milton Friedman, when he's confidently lecturing and telling people, how silly these protectionists are. Okay, so that's what I'm doing in this episode. Now, before I launch into it, let me try to soften the terrain a bit. And in case, I don't want conventional free traders who are feeling, I feel attacked by this episode. I don't want you to feel that way. I want you to be open-minded. So let me confess at the outset, I'm partly doing this as a mea culpa because I used to be that guy. Right. And in particular, and I'll even link to it because it'll be fun to see. I'm just making a note to also link to that tariff versus income tax in the show notes page for this episode in case you missed that one. It was like 2006, 2007, I think around, right? Yeah. Around that time frame where Peter Schiff was railing, for one thing, he was against the housing, not against it. He was warning of the housing bubble. And, he was getting mocked when he was going on CNBC or whatever by people. What are you talking about, Peter? Housing's great, blah, 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 that kind of stuff. But also he was pointing to the U.S. trade deficit. And he was saying this is a big problem. And he was using analogies like, if you get shipwrecked and you're on this tropical island and there's another guy on the tropical island and he keeps picking coconuts and you keep buying them from him, giving him slips of paper saying, I owe you a coconut plus some interest, like I owe you 1.1 coconuts next year, that kind of thing. And that's the economy of this tropical island now, that this guy does all the work picking all the coconuts and giving them to you, and you just keep giving him more and more slips of paper. Peter was saying, don't you think it would be kind of silly if people were like, hey, this doesn't seem sustainable, shouldn't you start producing, and living at least consistent with your means instead of, eating more than you're producing? And Peter was saying, would it be a good defense of that for, the guy who's just eating all the coconuts all the time and issuing these slips of paper to say, well, no, I mean, if you think about it, that guy grabbing the coconuts, he's dependent on me, right? He needs a market. He needs an outlet for all those coconuts. And so really, I kind of got him over a barrel because, he absolutely needs me to keep giving him these pieces of paper. And Peter's point obviously was, in that context, it's clear. Now, after a while, the guy picking the coconuts would say, well, why don't I just start eating the coconuts myself? This is silly. Why am I doing this? And so that was obviously Peter's analogy for China versus the United States. And he was mocking the standard free marketeer response about, no, this is great, this huge trade deficit that we have with China. It just shows how awesome the U.S. is. And, if China really needs us, because we're a big export market for all their stuff, and they would really be hurt and Peter's point was, well, no, as the Chinese develop, they're going to mature, and eventually their people are going to start consuming more, and they're going to realize, why do we just keep having everybody go to factories all the time, making TVs and other goodies to keep shipping over the ocean to Americans in exchange for claims on U.S. dollars that Peter thought are in a precarious situation, given all the debt and monetary inflation that the U.S. authorities were creating. And that eventually the Chinese are going to say, well, forget that. We're going to just produce for our own people, right? So that was what Peter was writing. And so at the time, again, this is 2006, 2007-ish, that era, I was writing articles nitpicking his points. And I was coming up with hypothetical examples of like an island in the Pacific that was taken over by a bunch of Rothbardians through voluntary means, of course. And, and I was just explaining how in that kind of a scenario where there's a bunch of people and they live on this place that doesn't have a lot of physical capital goods yet, but yet it's got great institutions, total free market for the win, private law enforcement and military defense, and everything is just completely privatized in a Rothbardian utopia. And I said, what would happen economically? And I said, oh, well, because now the productivity of labor and other factors would be a lot higher on that island, other things equal, just because of their, no taxes and stuff like that, no silly regulations. You would just see, aliens looking down from space would just see all sorts of resources and labor and stuff move to that island, because everybody on planet Earth would realize, well, not everybody, but lots of operations would realize, if we can relocate to that island, the productivity of our operations is going to be a lot higher, right? And so you would just see all kinds of resources flowing to that island, like, erecting factories and building power plants and, a lot of cheap housing to get in a bunch of workers who can then go in the factories and da-da-da-da, right? And because this place now is, where you want to locate if you want to make stuff. And then over time, skyscrapers would be erected and all the accountants and tax attorneys and computer programmers and stuff would move there as well, because they don't have taxes, and they just would need an internet connection to be able to still do work for all their clients around the world. Those would be construed as exports at that point. But in any event, I was saying, in terms of the trade statistics, you would see during the initial decade or two, while this economy, this little island was being transformed from a sleepy backwater into, the biggest economy on planet Earth, they would have massive trade deficits, right? Because they would be importing a lot more in terms of concrete and rubber and, barrels of crude oil and whatnot to get up and, to build everything, get all the infrastructure in place before they could then really, start cranking stuff out in terms of current output. And I was saying that wouldn't be a sign of their weakness or, the precariousness of their situation. That would be an indication of, because a lot of very sharp people think the future of this place is great. And that's why they're pouring all these resources into it on the front end, right? So I was doing stuff like that. And to his credit, Peter didn't, excommunicate me or boycott. He emailed me and was like, well, this is kind of like how many angels could dance on the head of a pin or something. You know what I mean? So in other words, he wasn't saying I was wrong, but he was like, come on, given what we're talking about right now, the actual U.S. in the real world, and these huge trade and budget deficits they're running, and the housing bubble, and blah, blah, blah. That's what he was saying. All right. So one last little piece of this story is I then issued a mea culpa. So part of what happened was, at the time, I was working at an investment firm, that was like managing client portfolios and stuff. And I was there in my role, I was an economist giving, research support and stuff like that. And the boss of this place was very bullish on the U.S. economy. And he did not think that housing was in trouble. He thought that, the Bush administration's economic policies were pretty good. He actually liked what the Fed was. Maybe he thought the Fed was being a little too loose, but he was okay with it and so forth. And so that just filtered down to me. And it was not that I thought, oh, this is what the boss wants to hear, so therefore, no, I genuinely believed the stuff I was saying at the time, and I also was bullish on the U.S. economy. And then after I left that operation and went and became a consultant on my own and just had clients and things like that, then all of a sudden I was looking at the same charts, the same data, and I was like, oh my gosh, there really is a huge housing bubble. There's going to be a big crash. All right, and I'll link to that. At Mises.org, I had a piece that went up in 2000, I think the fall of 2007, maybe November of 2007, saying the worst recession in 25 years, ? And I was just showing charts and whatever, saying, not only do I think there's a big crash coming, but I think this is going to be the worst recession since, the one in the early 80s, which ended up being true. All right, so part of why I'm just telling this now is it was at that point that I realized, so those CIA analysts and stuff that saw weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, maybe they weren't all just lying. I think the people at the top were lying, but the standard analysts who were looking at aerial photographs and saying, hey, what is that? I think that's some, sarin gas or canisters of gas or whatever. I could see how they just institutionally, if this is what the boss wants and whatever, and you just know that, hey, this is the way to get ahead in this way, that you start seeing stuff like that. Anyway, that's kind of an aside. Last point from this long anecdote that went longer than I wanted to, but hey, I hope this is entertaining for you folks, is so I, basically did a mea culpa, and I said, hey, I know I've been writing things that are bullish on the U.S. economy lately, but now I realize I was mistaken. I think there's a big crash coming, blah, blah, blah. And then, the big crash happened. And then after that, somebody reached out to me. And when I say after, I mean like 2010, maybe something like that. Well after the crash happened and everything, we're into the Obama years. Through, booking or whatever, somebody from the Peter Schiff radio show reached out to me and said, hey, do you want to be a guest? And I said, okay. And it wasn't going to be Peter, he was on vacation or something. So it was somebody guest hosting. And I said, yeah, sure. And I think, they probably told me over email, they want to talk about, trade deficits or something like that. I can't remember exactly how it was presented to me over email, but I was like, yeah, sure. That's great. I like Peter, like his show. And so I get on there and the guy's talking to me, and this is live, we're on the air, and he, and I don't remember who it is right now. And he's asking me my view, and I was just saying, oh yeah. And he was basically contrasting what Peter Schiff's view had been about trade deficits and why they posed a problem versus, the standard libertarian, hey, everything's great. It's voluntary trade. Trade statistics are completely meaningless and, blah, 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 that kind of stuff. And I was agreeing with the guy. And I was like, yeah, right. And then he even went so far as he was like, but, and you could tell he was getting flustered. And I realized later what had happened is I think he wanted a spicy show. He's guest hosting for Peter Schiff. So he wanted to line up some guests that were, I wasn't the only guy in the, he had me for a half an hour, then he was going to have somebody else or whatever. And so I think he had done some research and then found me arguing with Peter from a few years earlier, because I was citing Peter by name and quoting him and then giving my hypothetical counterexamples to show, Well, actually, in terms of the accounting, this isn't not, trade deficit could be consistent with a booming economy, blah, blah, blah. And so I think this guy wanted some controversy and conflict and have some fireworks going. So he wanted to argue with me, him taking Peter's position. And, oh, yeah, grab me some economist that one of these mainstream guys or whatever that disagrees with Peter, or maybe he thought, these libertarian ideologues or something. And so when I was just sitting there agreeing with him, he was actually getting flustered because there was no clash. And then he finally just said, but Dr. Murphy, I'm looking at this article you wrote from whatever, and you said this. And I just went, oh yeah, I was totally wrong. Yeah, I was totally wrong. And there was a couple beats went by and the guy just goes, I've never heard an economist say that before. So anyway, that's my anecdote to warm you folks up. So now that hopefully I've made you realize I am not the enemy here. I am just trying to show you we can get wrapped up and miss the forest for the trees. So the motivation for today's episode recently, Timothy Sandifer, I hope I'm not just getting mixed up, but I think that he and I are both Hillsdale College graduates. And I think maybe even we were either the same year or close together. Okay. Or maybe this is a totally different guy. But anyway, on Twitter, I saw Timothy Sandifer. He was responding to this other guy that he was arguing with about trade deficits. And the other guy says, we cannot keep running the massive trade deficits. Yes, tariffs are a tax. So are trade deficits. It's just that trade deficits allow you to keep kicking the can down the road for some time. All right. So to be clear, I don't agree that a trade deficit is a tax. I don't think that's a useful way to think about it. But anyway, that's what that guy said. Then Sandifer, retweeting and then saying to his own audience in response to this, says, trade deficits are almost literally the opposite of a tax. A trade deficit occurs when you're rich enough to pay others to make things for you. Then you buy from them and they don't buy from you. That's a good thing. Okay, so he's unambiguously saying a trade deficit is a good thing, okay. And then in the next tweet, Sandifer follows up and says something like, I don't have it in front of me, but he said something like, I'm about to go to Safeway and run up my trade deficit with them. Okay. And then in the comments of Sandifer's broadside here, this other guy chimes in and says, I can't even grasp how trade deficits are supposed to be bad. Do people think they're like budget deficits? Okay. And he got 103 hearts on that. Okay. So that's why I decided that, yeah, this is still a hot topic. And there are a lot of people, and I know Sandifer is like a conservative. I don't know if he's a Republican, but he's definitely like a right-wing conservative type of guy in terms of U.S. politics. Okay. Again, if it's the same guy, he went to Hillsdale. So that's why I'm saying these are just random people, that these are a lot of right-wing conservative types who maybe they like Trump on some things, but they don't get this whole protectionist stuff. And so again, I feel for these people because like, oh, they did study libertarian economics, so good for them. But yet, I think they're relying too heavily on some sound bites from that literature. Okay, that's kind of the point I'm making here. Also, one last bit of housekeeping. I will also link to, you may be experiencing deja vu, that on November 23rd of 2024, it was episode 475. I did a similar episode as the one you're hearing now in terms of the billing for it, that I was saying, hey, I'm going to come in and go through some standard free market economist arguments on free trade and just show you don't take it too far, something like that. So last night I just went through and re-listened to that at double speed. Just I don't want to sit there listening to myself to make sure I don't repeat myself. All right. So in case you're thinking, yeah, Bob didn't, is this like a recycle? That no, I'm going to say different things in this episode than I did in that one. Okay. So let me first deal with the issue of, oh, hey, I'm going to go run a trade deficit with Safeway. Okay. That's true insofar as it goes, right? And again, with this stuff, it depends what level of sophistication you want to take it to. All right. So I agree. If you're in a lot of stuff from Trump himself, yeah, he talks at times as if a trade deficit is analogous to a corporation having an unprofitable quarter, like losing money. That, oh, if the U.S. exports more to if the U.S. imports more from Canada than we're exporting to them, they're somehow ripping us off. And that's analogous to a corporation spending more on inputs, hiring workers and raw materials and whatever, and then making a product and selling it to the customers and not even recouping our monetary expenses. And the accountant comes to us at the end of the quarter or the year and says, we lost money. The revenue was lower than the cost of goods sold. And, so that's a loss. And yes, at times Trump's statements on international trade make it sound like that's how he's thinking about it. And that is clearly wrong. And that's an extremely crude way of thinking about it. And so, yes, if that's what you're dealing with, to then say, hey, I'm going to go run a trade deficit with my local grocery store, but I also am going to run a trade surplus with my employer, that's a useful thing to say to get people warmed up to it. And if I'm teaching an undergrad class in economics and it's the week that I'm devoting to free trade or something, yeah, I'm going to make sure they get that basic point. Okay, but that's not where you can stop. Okay, because if all you did were to say that, it makes it sound like, oh, so yeah, the U.S. runs trade deficits with some countries, but it runs trade surpluses with other countries, and it kind of balances out. Just like, if you're a household, you sell more of your exports, if you want to talk like that, to your employer. They pay you more money for your exports than what you spend money on their stuff. And so you have a trade surplus with your employer. And then that's the way you afford to run trade deficits with all the stores. Or if you go on vacation to Disney World or something, then, you have a trade deficit with that geographical region, if you want to think of it like that. If you want to think of it in terms of physical areas as opposed to companies. Okay. But then still, what would it mean for a household if they were in trouble, right? It's okay for a household to have a trade deficit with Safeway, but if you found out that, the household in general has a trade deficit, right, for the entire year, aggregating all of the possible or all the different organizations that the household did business with, they ended up spending more than they earned in income, then, and spending more on consumption too, if you really clarified it, right? That would be the clincher. Then that would be concerning, right? Or it could be, right? You'd want to investigate, see, I need to know more information before I give a clean bill of health to the finances of this household, right? And we'll get to that in a second. So again, the fact that the U.S. runs a bilateral trade deficit with some particular country, yep, that's not a big deal. And they do, in fact, run bilateral trade surpluses with some other countries. But when you aggregate them all together, the U.S.'s total trade deficits with particular countries vastly outweighs its total trade surpluses with other countries, such that overall, the U.S. on net has a trade deficit vis-a-vis the rest of the world. Okay, so again, Tim Sandifer saying, "Oh, I'm going to go run a trade deficit with Safeway or something." Yeah, again, that's a good thing to say to get people warmed up. But if that's where you stop and you're like, "Oh, so all this concern about trade deficit is misleading at best," right? Or at the very least, you're sticking your chin out and then you're giving the protectionists, the guys like Orrin Cass or whatever, you're giving them an easy opportunity to come back and say, "Okay, yeah, and if a household is earning $100,000 a year and they're spending $130,000 a year with all the various merchants in their town, that is a problem." And that's what the U.S. is doing. Okay. So there's that element. Now you could say, let me just take it one layer deeper. You could come back, and this is the kind of stuff I was doing with Peter Schiff, when I was, arguing the other side on this stuff. And you could come back and say, well, no, even a household that is running a general trade deficit, if that's the language you want to use, that still could be consistent with financial wisdom and, being good stewards of the resources or whatever. Because what if you're talking about a retired person, right? Somebody's worked for decades, accumulated a bunch of assets. Now the guy is 75, and year after year, he is living off of the income and even partially drawing down perhaps the assets that he's accumulated, right? So he's got a bunch of stocks and bonds and, maybe he owns some real estate and whatever, got tenants in there paying rental income. And again, what if just year after year, his net worth is slowly shrinking? And that's, because he's consuming whatever, $100,000 worth a year. The income from his assets is only $70,000. So he's consuming that current income, and then on that $30,000 a year, he's eating into his capital. And but he's fine because he thinks he's going to die before he runs out, and then he's still going to have some left over to give to his kids or whatever, right? That's not a problem. And that guy is running a trade deficit with the rest of the world, but that doesn't mean he's doing something stupid, right? Okay. And so then, though, you got to say, is that what the U.S. is doing? Because I can come up with another scenario where, there's some guy who's 25 and he's just working some odd jobs here and there, and he's running up credit cards, or he's borrowing money from all of his relatives, and that's the way he's getting by. Or, he had the family farm or something that his parents gave him if they died earlier, or you could change it to a guy being 45. And he's taking out a mortgage on the family farm, and that's how he's getting by. Or he's selling off gold coins that his uncle gave him when he died or something. And that's the way the guy's making ends meet, is he's selling off his assets here and there, or he's mortgaging them. All right. And the guy's 45. And so it's not that this is part of a well-structured long-term retirement plan. It's just, no, he's fumbling about. He's desperate. He doesn't know what to do. He's got to eat. And so he's doing whatever he can to leverage his assets. Okay. That is a situation of a guy who's running a trade deficit with the rest of the world. And I think most people looking at that would say, yeah, that's not a healthy sign. Now, to be clear, it's not that the trade deficit per se is the bad thing, right? If there is some guy who just can't find work and he has to sell off gold coins that his uncle gave him, or he's got to take out a mortgage on the family farm because otherwise he's going to starve, he's glad that the bank grants the mortgage. He's glad that there's somebody out there willing to pay him money for the gold coins, right? So it's not, those individual transactions. I mean, those are voluntary transactions, right? So don't misunderstand what I'm saying. But the point is, an outsider looking at some of the financial statistics pertaining to this guy's situation who said, eek, that doesn't look very healthy, that you're spending a lot more than you're taking in income from your current export or the production of your services, and or renting out your farmland or something like that, but that you're eating into your assets or you're taking on net debt. That's not a good sign. That you understand what the people are saying, and there's a perfectly reasonable interpretation of that. It would be silly just to say, no, it's all voluntary transactions. Who are you to judge? I mean, you could say that, and you could say no one's rights are being violated, and there's no role for a libertarian police system and court system to come in and stop the guy. Those are all true statements. But for someone just to say, this guy's not running his life very well, he really ought to go and try to get some skills and get a job or something, that would be a perfectly reasonable thing to say. Okay, so that's the kind of situation I'm talking about here. So you can see, yes, you can come up with hypothetical scenarios where the trade statistics would look a certain way, and that would be consistent with wise stewardship in a bright financial future. But you can also come up with scenarios where the opposite is the case. And so the question is just, if people are wringing their hands over the U.S. situation, either now or if they've been doing it for 20 years, which of those two is a better analogy to what's going on? So here, let me just flash up a chart showing the U.S. trade deficit is a share of GDP. And this chart goes from 1929 all the way up to 2024, because I think these are annual figures that they have on this chart. Okay. So you can see for most of the U.S. history on this chart, for most of the history up until the early 1970s, it was largely in surplus, right? The only exception was at the peak of World War II. And we'll talk in a bit about, what could be driving that. Why did the U.S. have a big trade deficit? And when I say big, I mean 1% of GDP was the peak of it in World War II. And then after the war ended, you see there was a huge trade surplus in the late 40s. Okay, and then it bounced around a lot, but it was typically positive. And then in the 70s, it started a downward slide. And, it got really bad in the mid-2000s. But, recovered somewhat, but still, it's been around a trade deficit of around 3% of GDP since 2012, something like that. Okay, so what's going on there? Is it that the U.S. economy was really bad right after World War II and in the 50s and 60s, and then the U.S. economy all of a sudden got awesome, from 1973 or something to the present? I don't think that's what the explanation for this chart is. I think the explanation clearly is Richard Nixon finally killing the gold standard in the early 70s. To me, that is the single biggest structural change to explain that chart. And so part of what's going on there, one thing is, in general, if the U.S. dollar is the world's reserve currency, once you completely unshackle the U.S. government's ability to create dollars, and here I'm, wrapping the Federal Reserve into the U.S. government, broadly speaking, then there's a sense in which, that's good as far as it goes, right? We send $100 bills as our exports, if you want to think of it like that, and the rest of the world sends us goodies to get those dollars. And that's good work if you can get it. All right, so that's partly what I think, is the explanation for that. And as far as, what happened there during the war years, well, there's a connection between government budget deficits and the U.S. trade deficit. So that's partly why it was ironic that other guy in, Tim Sandifer's comments of his tweet said, I don't even get, how could someone even think a trade deficit is a bad thing? Do they think it's a budget deficit? So yes, they're conceptually distinct, but in practice, I think there is a big connection between U.S. government budget deficits and the U.S. trade deficit. And so there's two ways you can think about it. So I'll do like the mechanical way first, and then I'll do the more big picture accounting way. So mechanically, if the U.S. government is running a bigger budget deficit, like they want to spend more money and they're not bringing in more receipts, so they have to borrow more to cover that, other things equal, what's going to happen? Well, if the U.S. government needs to issue more bonds, it has to get more people to be willing to lend more to the U.S. government that fiscal period. Interest rates, yields on U.S. government debt have to be higher than they otherwise would have been to induce people to lend more to them. So other things equal, investors around the world now see that yields on U.S. government treasuries are higher than in the counterfactual, so they want to adjust their portfolios and get more into, U.S. government debt. And so foreigners around the world try to use their currencies to buy U.S. dollars to then lend to the government, right? Because the U.S. government's borrowing in dollars. And so that tends to strengthen the U.S. dollar vis-a-vis these other currencies. So that makes it easier for Americans to import goods from those other countries, right? Because now the dollar is stronger. And so it makes it harder for the foreigners to buy U.S. exports. So that tends to increase the U.S. trade deficit. If you want to look at it just in terms of the macro accounting, big picture, if foreigners want to accumulate on net more treasury securities, which are claims, on future income flows or cash flows from the U.S. government, what are they going to, they have to give us something in exchange for that. So what are they going to give us? Well, if the U.S. government wants to get goods and services with that, it's not that the U.S. government is issuing more treasury debt in order to accumulate Japanese stocks or bonds. right? Or real estate in Australia. No, the U.S. government is buying goods and services, especially if we're talking about the middle of World War II. Then what ends up happening is the foreigners have to send us goods and services in exchange for them now getting pieces of paper saying, in the future, the U.S. government owes you, whatever, $10,000. Okay, so that's another way of seeing it. And so what does that mean if foreigners are sending us a bunch of goodies? That's a trade deficit, or that increases the trade deficit. All right, so those are ways to think about that. So what's interesting then, what I say to the MAGA people is, sure, we can talk about tariffs or whatever, but don't get your hopes up that the base is a lot lower, and don't necessarily think you're going to snap your fingers and raise tariffs a little bit and then the budget's balanced and that kind of thing. And I say, if it's really the trade deficit you don't like, a more straightforward way to bring that down predictably, rather than raising tariff rates, is to cut U.S. government spending, right? And then that would lower the budget deficit, and then that will very straightforwardly reduce the trade deficit. Whereas, again, raising tariffs won't necessarily do it, right? Because in general, if you just make it harder for the U.S. to import stuff, well, then that means foreigners have fewer dollars with which to buy our exports, right? So clamping down on one direction of the flow of international trade tends to dry up the opposite flow as well. It's not that if you could somehow use tariffs to get Americans to import less, that the exports would stay the same, and therefore you'd be shrinking the trade deficit by that much. That's not typically how it would work. Okay. So let me now just broaden the analysis here so you don't think I'm just picking on some non-economists on Twitter, even though I'm not afraid to do that. So here, let me read some excerpts from a 2018 Wall Street Journal op-ed. So at the time, Harvard economist Robert Barro had an op-ed where he was responding to all of the, protectionist elements of supporting Trump at that time. That was the first Trump administration. And so here, let me just read 2 paragraphs from Barro's op-ed. And to be clear, he's going to say things, these are true statements that he's going to make, but then I'm going to read to you the Wall Street Journal editor, who was putting the title and the subtitle on this piece, said things that were wrong. So here we go. So this is Barro speaking. The Trump theory of international trade seems straightforward. Selling stuff to foreigners is good, and buying stuff from foreigners is bad. It's a form of mercantilism. Exports are attractive because they represent domestic production and American jobs. Imports are undesirable because that production and employment otherwise could have happened at home. Simple economic reasoning, however, suggests that this logic is backward. Imports are things we want, whether consumer goods, raw materials, or intermediate goods. Exports are the price we have to pay to get the imports. It would be great, in fact, if we could get more imports without having to pay for them through added exports. All right, so it's that last sentence that's key. So like I say, technically, strictly speaking, I don't think he said anything that I would say is wrong or false in those 2 paragraphs I just read to you. But the Wall Street Journal then slapped a title on that said, Trump and China share a bad idea on trade, and the subtitle said, imports are things we want and we pay for them with exports. Isn't getting more for less a good thing? Okay, and so in the context there, and this, led other people to say this too, that's clearly suggesting that a trade deficit is a good thing, right? And you saw Timothy Sandifer was saying, no, it's a good thing. And the other guy, the guy under, like, how could anyone possibly think a trade deficit would be a bad thing, right? And so if you think of it like this, that you're thinking, oh, the imports are the goodies and the exports are the lamentable, necessary cost. Well, to get more benefits at lower cost, that's a good thing. So that means a trade deficit per se is good, right? If that's the way you're thinking. And in case you think I'm jumping to conclusions here, I'm going to play you a clip from Milton Friedman saying exactly the argument that I just attributed to the Wall Street Journal editor.
Almost always about how we must export. And what's really good is an industry that produces export. And if we buy from abroad and import, that's bad. But surely that's just upside down as well. What we send abroad, we can't eat, we can't wear, we can't use for our houses. The goods and services we send abroad are goods and services not available to us. On the other hand, the goods and services we import, they provide us with TV sets we can watch, with automobiles we can drive, with all sorts of nice things for us to use. The gain from foreign trade is what we import. What we export is the cost of getting those imports. And the proper objective for a nation, as Adam Smith put it, is to arrange things so we get as large a volume of imports as possible for as small a volume of exports as possible. When people talk about a favorable balance of trade, what is that term taken to mean? It's taken to mean that we export more than we import. But from the point of view of our well-being, that's an unfavorable balance. That means we're sending out more goods and getting fewer in. Each of you in your private household would know better than that. You don't regard it as a favorable balance when you have to send out more goods to get less coming in. It's favorable when you can get more by sending out less. This tendency to concentrate on the productive side of our lives and to neglect the side of consumption is reinforced by the fact that even for the productive side of our lives, the visible effects of tariffs are good, the invisible effects of tariffs are bad, even on the productive side. It's perfectly clear that if you restrict the imports of steel, there are some workers in the steel industry who will have jobs they otherwise would not have. The beneficial effects for them of a tariff is perfectly clear. But if we import less steel, foreigners earn fewer dollars. They have fewer dollars to spend in this country. There are people around the country who will not have jobs, not have productive jobs. But that's invisible. The people who might have been producing goods to sell abroad don't know they might have had that job. So, out of sight, out of mind. And as a result, on both the side of consumption and the side of producers, you have the concentrated special interest versus the diffuse general interest.
Okay, and I played a bit of it there just so you didn't think I was taking them out of context. All right, so to be clear, what Milton Friedman just said is totally wrong. Well, it's wrong. Totally wrong might make it sound like every little syllable. But no, that is just wrong. All right, and what's happening here is there's a equivocation on the words imports and exports, right? If by import you mean foreigners are shipping us goods with no strings attached, then yes, what Milton Friedman just said is true. But that's not what an import is. An import is when foreigners sell us goods and services. And we send them money, right? And a trade deficit isn't saying foreigners are sending us more goods for free than we're shipping to foreigners for free. If that's what a trade deficit were, then yeah, a trade deficit would be good. Every country would be striving for a trade deficit, and any country stupid enough to have a trade surplus, you'd say, what are you doing? Why are you sending goods for free to them, more goods than they're sending to you for free? And then after a while, as I'm talking like this, I hope you're realizing I'm not talking about commerce at all. And yes, if there weren't money involved in commerce, these statements would make sense, right? So that's what's going on here and again, it's understandable. I realize why Milton Friedman, why those combination of words came out of his mouth and what led him, freeze, record scratch. You may be wondering how I got here, that I could be a Nobel Prize winning economist. I just said a bunch of nonsense confidently from this podium talking to people about international trade. Again, what happened is this fumbling of, trying to get people to see the logic of it, that, oh yeah, the reason our nation benefits from international trade is it gives us opportunities to import goods on better terms than we could produce it domestically, right? And that's one of the things that Adam Smith drove home, and then David Ricardo really expanded the logic with, the discussion about comparative advantage. Okay. So that's all true. And that does show why protectionism is silly as an economic philosophy or, policy agenda. Okay. So that's all true. But I'm just saying the specific way that Friedman there motivated it is wrong. And even when he was like, any of you is in your capacity as a private household. Okay. So you see some guy and he's working in his job and he's earning $200,000 a year. And you say, oh, how much did you consume this year? And he says, oh, I consumed 150,000. I live in this really a nice penthouse and the rent's pretty high and I lease this car. And so I pay a lot for that. And it's a sports car and blah, blah, blah. And, I go to fancy restaurants, but I save $50,000 a year. What? According to the literal words Milton Friedman just said, this guy's an idiot. Why are you giving 200,000, what you're giving more to the community than they're giving to you? What are you doing that for? You should rearrange your affairs. Haven't you read Adam Smith? You should try to arrange it so that you consume $200,000 worth of stuff from the community every year and only sell them $150,000 of stuff. That would be the way to conduct your household wisely. That's what Adam Smith, you realize, no, that's not at all what Adam Smith taught. Okay. So again, the problem here is when you're talking about imports and exports, and this is the problem with, the Wall Street Journal approach to that. Yes, if the U.S. could export 1,000 bushels of wheat, and you say, how many cars will Japan send us in exchange? And it's just a bilateral barter transaction, then yes, the more cars Japan will send us for a given number of bushels of wheat exports, the better off our people are, the higher our standard of living. That's true. But that's not the same thing as saying if the U.S. exports a certain dollar amount of goods to Japan, then the more dollars worth of goods they send us, the better off we are. No, because the dollars are capturing that, right? It's not that they're sending us the cars for free and then we're sending them the bushels of wheat for free, and that's what the trade is. No, we're sending them the bushels by saying we're exporting whatever, $100 billion worth of wheat. We mean we send them the wheat and they sent us dollars. That was that trade. End of story. And then as a separate transaction, if we buy $80 billion of cars from them, they send us the cars and we send them $80 billion. End of transaction. And then on net, our people have less wheat, more cars, and $20 billion less in net assets. Okay. And so that might be consistent with prosperity. That's, that could be okay, but it might not be okay. Okay. And you can't just make that go away by saying, well, no, every household strives to that. You're missing the point. Okay. And so as I wrap this up, let me just say, thinking along these lines has made me realize that even some of the pot shots that I used to take as a college professor at the old mercantilist, just again, trying to get the kids to think about it. And he'd say stuff like, oh yes, the old mercantilists back in the day, they would advise the kings and the rulers of their, respective countries in Europe and whatnot, that you want to conduct yourself so that in general, your kingdom has more gold and silver flowing into it in any given period than flows out. And so how does that happen? Well, if your people sell more stuff to other European nations than vice versa, then that's the way you would get more gold and silver flowing in to your coffers. And that's a wise maxim of statecraft. And then of course Adam Smith comes along and blows that up. And again, there's nothing wrong with that per se. And what's David Hume's price specie flow mechanism is an important element in terms of economists gradually coming to understand this stuff. That you could have two countries, and if one of them is running a trade deficit vis-a-vis the other one, what's going to happen is, and let's say they both use gold coins as the money. Well, the gold coins are going to flow out of the country with the trade deficit and flow into the other country. And then Hume's point was, over time, what's going to happen is as money becomes more dear, scarcer in the first country, prices quoted in gold coins are eventually going to start dropping, right? The people in that country can't continue to pay the same amount of gold to their own domestic merchants because they're just running out of gold coins, right? Because they're all on net getting shipped over to the neighboring country. And so after a while, prices have to fall in that first country, quoted in gold, physical weights of gold. And the opposite's happened in the other country where they got all this gold flowing in, that now those people have more gold coins in their pockets. And so they're able to spend more on their merchants. And so if that process were to continue, eventually prices in that other country are going to rise, quoted in gold. And so Hume's point is there's a natural mechanism that's going to eventually stop that flow, that after a while, as things become more and more expensive in the country that originally was the net exporter, its people are going to start buying imports from the other country because things are going to be cheaper, right? And there's that natural thing. So Hume's point was government officials don't need to wring their hands and worry about, oh man, if we don't take measures, put the proper measures in place, our country's just going to get emptied out of gold and silver coins, right? So that's that's true as far as it goes, and you need to kind of understand that as an economist. And then even in our age of fiat money, there's a similar mechanism where if one country continually runs trade deficits with another, you would think eventually that would make the first country's currency weaken. And so you would think eventually that, now imports to that country become more and more expensive. And so eventually it flips and then that country becomes a net exporter. And that mechanism would largely be true. Where there's a giant asterisk is, well, what if the first country issues the global reserve currency and other people around the world are happy to just accumulate pretty big stockpiles of that currency, or, assets, fixed income assets denominated like treasuries or whatever, or very safe corporate bonds denominated in the US dollar, then you have a lot more of a runway where you can chronically run trade deficits for a long time, and that Hume's price specie flow mechanism doesn't kick in and automatically reverse it because the foreigners just keep accumulating stockpiles because now the US dollar, is serving that role that gold used to. Okay. Last thing I will say on all this is Deuteronomy 15 verse 6 says, "For the Lord your God will bless you just as he promised you. You shall lend to many nations, but you shall not borrow. You shall reign over many nations, but they shall not reign over you." All right, so it's that middle part. You shall lend to many nations, but you shall not borrow. So in context, the Lord is clearly telling these people, this is going to be a sign of your prosperity and why you are going to advance vis-a-vis other nations, is that you're going to lend to them. You're not going to borrow from them. And that's how you're going to rise above them economically, right? And so does God not know about comparative advantage? Did God not know what Adam Smith was going to write in 1776? Is he not familiar with the price specie flow mechanism? Does he not know the difference between a capital account surplus and a capital account deficit and things like that? Pretty sure God knows about that stuff, right? And yet it's pretty straightforward. You can understand why God telling the children of Israel, you shall lend to many nations, but you shall not borrow, why that's a promise to them about, look at how much I'm going to bless you. That everybody can see in terms of common sense. Yes, in general, that would be a good thing to happen, is that we lend to the rest of the world and not vice versa. Okay? And so all I'm saying, especially to religiously minded right-wing conservatives who don't like MAGA and its protectionism, right, there's a lot of economic nonsense coming out of the Trump administration right now on this stuff. But don't lose the common sense element that, as a general rule, if your country is running up massive debts, especially to fuel, not, building factories and stuff like that, but to just run massive government budget deficits that are not wise. And that's the way in which foreigners keep accumulating on net more claims against us in the future. In general, no, that's not a very good state of affairs. And I think a lot of people steeped in the free trade literature should be more careful before they pounce on that kind of stuff. And so, you idiot, what are you talking about? Besides it being incorrect, I think it also just gives more ammunition to guys like Orrin Cass, and they can just look at their crowd and say, look at these guys. They think it's good that we keep borrowing more from China. They think that just shows how strong we are. No, that's not a good idea, right? Okay. All right, folks, thanks for your attention. See you next time.
Check back next week for a new episode of the Human Action Podcast. In the meantime, you can find more content like this on Mises.org.